Hello, and welcome to our exploration of one of history's most misunderstood philosophical traditions, Stoicism. I'm delighted you've joined us today as we unravel the common myths about what the Stoics really thought about emotions and happiness. When most people hear the word Stoic, they immediately picture a cold, emotionless person, someone who suppresses all feelings and faces life's challenges with an impassive poker face. Be stoic, we're told when facing difficulties, as if the proper response is to deny our humanity and become like living statues. But is this truly what the ancient Stoics advocated? Did philosophers like Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius really believe that the path to wisdom meant emotional numbness? The answer, which might surprise many, is a resounding no. This widespread misconception represents perhaps one of the most persistent and damaging misunderstandings in the history of philosophy. Today, we'll begin our journey by examining what the Stoics actually taught about emotions and happiness, and why these teachings have been so profoundly misinterpreted over the centuries. Let's travel back to the painted Stoa in Athens around 300 BCE, where Zeno of Citium first began teaching the philosophy that would eventually bear the name of its birthplace. The Stoics developed a sophisticated psychological theory that didn't reject emotions outright, but rather sought to understand them deeply. They recognized that human beings are inherently emotional creatures, and their goal was never to eliminate feelings, but to transform our relationship with them. The Stoics made a crucial distinction that is often overlooked in popular accounts. They differentiated between what they called passions, pathos, which were excessive, irrational emotional responses based on false judgments, and good feelings, eupatheiai, which were rational, measured emotional responses based on accurate understanding of reality. This distinction is absolutely fundamental to understanding Stoic psychology, yet it's frequently absent from modern discussions. Imagine walking through ancient Rome with Seneca, one of Stoicism's most eloquent advocates. He wouldn't advise you to feel nothing when you see suffering or experience loss. Instead, he might explain that there's a profound difference between destructive grief that consumes you entirely and appropriate sadness that acknowledges loss while maintaining your capacity to function and help others. The Stoics weren't advocating for emotional suppression. They were offering a sophisticated path toward emotional intelligence and resilience. Another pervasive myth is that Stoics were indifferent to happiness. Many believe they advocated for a grim, joyless existence focused solely on duty and virtue. This mischaracterization couldn't be further from the truth. The Stoics were deeply concerned with eudaimonia, a Greek term often translated as happiness, but perhaps better understood as flourishing or living well. They believed that virtue was the only true good precisely because they saw it as the path to genuine happiness. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor, wrote extensively about finding joy in simple things, in nature, in human connection, in performing one's role well. The Stoics weren't against happiness. They were offering what they believed was the most reliable path to sustainable happiness, one not dependent on external circumstances that could be taken away in an instant. The confusion stems partly from the Stoic concept of preferred indifference, things like health, wealth, and reputation that they considered naturally desirable but not essential for virtue or happiness. Modern readers often misinterpret this nuanced position as complete indifference to life's pleasures and pains. But the Stoics weren't suggesting we shouldn't enjoy good health or prosperity when we have it, only that we shouldn't make our happiness entirely dependent on such externals. As we begin this journey together, I invite you to set aside preconceptions about Stoicism as a philosophy of emotional suppression or joyless endurance. Instead, Let's approach these ancient teachings with fresh eyes, understanding them as a sophisticated psychological framework for developing emotional resilience and finding lasting happiness in an unpredictable world. In the coming segments, we'll dive deeper into specific Stoic teachings about emotions, examining what philosophers like Epictetus meant when he spoke about controlling what we can and accepting what we cannot. We'll explore Seneca's nuanced writings on anger and grief and discover how these ancient wisdom traditions might offer surprisingly relevant guidance for our modern emotional challenges. The Stoics weren't emotional robots. They were thoughtful human beings seeking to understand the complexity of our inner lives and find a path toward genuine flourishing. Let's discover together what they really taught and how these teachings might enrich our own emotional lives today. Now that we've dispelled the common misconception of Stoics as emotionless automatons, let's delve deeper into what these ancient philosophers actually taught about our emotional lives. Their sophisticated understanding of human psychology offers insights that remain remarkably relevant today. The Stoics developed what modern scholars call a cognitive theory of emotions, a revolutionary approach that recognized emotions not as irrational forces that simply happen to us, but as complex experiences involving our judgments and beliefs about the world. This insight forms the cornerstone of many contemporary psychological approaches, including cognitive behavioral therapy. Chrysippus, one of Stoicism's early architects, described emotions as judgments, evaluative responses to our perceptions. When we feel fear, for instance, we're not just experiencing a physical sensation, we're making a judgment that something threatening is present and that harm is imminent. This cognitive component of emotion was central to Stoic psychology. Consider what happens when you're anxious about an upcoming presentation. Your heart races, your palms sweat, your thoughts spiral. The Stoics would say these physical sensations begin with a judgment. In this case, perhaps the belief that your performance will determine your entire professional worth, or that any mistake would be catastrophically embarrassing. Epictetus captured this principle perfectly when he wrote, "Men are disturbed not by things, but by the views which they take of them." This insight, that our emotional responses are shaped by our interpretations rather than by events themselves, offers a profound key to emotional resilience. It suggests that by examining and potentially revising our judgments, we can transform our emotional experiences. But here's where the common misunderstanding creeps in. The Stoics weren't suggesting we should eliminate all emotions. Rather, they distinguished between different types of emotional responses. They used the term pathe, often translated as passions, to describe emotions based on mistaken judgments about what is truly good or harmful. These included excessive fear, grief, desire, and pleasure, not because feeling itself was problematic, but because these particular feelings stemmed from false beliefs about what matters. Seneca, in his essay on anger, doesn't argue that we should never feel displeasure at wrongdoing. Instead, he distinguishes between destructive rage that clouds judgment and leads to harm versus appropriate moral disapproval that maintains rational clarity. The first he considered a passion to be avoided, the second, a rational response aligned with wisdom. In contrast to these problematic passions, the Stoics described eupathei, good feelings that arise from accurate judgments about the world. These included joy, chara, caution, eulabia, and reasonable wishing, boulesis. Far from rejecting all emotional experience, they celebrated these rational, measured emotional responses as part of the good life. Marcus Aurelius practiced this distinction daily. In his Meditations, he repeatedly reminds himself to examine his judgments when faced with challenging situations. When someone behaves poorly, he doesn't suppress his response but transforms it. moving from anger based on the judgment that the person should know better to understanding based on the judgment that people act badly out of ignorance rather than malice. This Stoic approach offers something far more sophisticated than mere suppression. It provides a framework for developing what we might now call emotional intelligence. The ability to understand our emotional responses, recognize their cognitive foundations, and reshape them when they're based on faulty judgments. Consider grief, an emotion the Stoics have been particularly criticized for supposedly rejecting. When Epictetus advises his students not to be overwhelmed by grief at the loss of a loved one, he isn't suggesting they shouldn't feel sadness. Rather, he's inviting them to examine the judgment that often intensifies grief beyond measure, the belief that we cannot live well without what we've lost. Seneca, who experienced exile and lost his own child, wrote with profound empathy about grief. He acknowledged the naturalness of tears and sadness while offering guidance on how to prevent grief from becoming destructive. "Let tears flow," he wrote, "but let them also cease." This nuanced approach recognizes both the inevitability of painful emotions and our capacity to work with them constructively. The Stoic approach to emotions wasn't about becoming coldly rational at the expense of feeling. It was about integrating reason and emotion into a harmonious whole, developing what they called the smooth flow of life. They recognized that emotions informed by wisdom enhance our humanity rather than diminish it. As we continue our exploration, we'll next examine how this sophisticated emotional theory connected to the Stoic vision of happiness and flourishing. We'll discover why they believed that emotional resilience wasn't just about avoiding distress, but about creating the conditions for genuine joy and contentment, a eudaimonic life that remains accessible even in challenging circumstances. The Stoics offer us not emotional suppression, but emotional transformation, a path toward feeling deeply and wisely in a complex and unpredictable world. Having explored how the Stoics viewed emotions not as enemies to be suppressed, but as experiences to be understood and transformed, we now turn to their conception of happiness, what they called eudaimonia. This vision of human flourishing reveals perhaps the most profound misunderstanding about Stoicism, that it's a philosophy of mere endurance rather than one that offers a positive path to joy and fulfillment. The Stoics propose something revolutionary, that genuine happiness doesn't depend on external circumstances, but on living virtuously in accordance with nature. Zeno, the founder of Stoicism, described this as living in agreement, a harmonious alignment between our actions and the rational order of the cosmos. This wasn't a call to grit your teeth through hardship, but an invitation to discover a deeper, more stable form of happiness. Imagine walking through an ancient Athenian marketplace with Epictetus. All around you, people bustle about, pursuing what they believe will make them happy: wealth, status, pleasure, comfort. Epictetus might point out how these pursuits leave people vulnerable, their happiness constantly threatened by fortune's whims. See how they suffer, he might say, not because life is difficult, but because they've placed their happiness in things they cannot control. This brings us to the famous Stoic dichotomy of control, the distinction between what is up to us, epaihemen, and what is not. Epictetus begins his Enchiridion with this principle. Some things are within our power while others are not. Within our power are opinion, motivation, desire, aversion, and, in a word, whatever is of our own doing. Not within our power are our body, our property, reputation, office, and, in a word, whatever is not of our own doing. The Stoics recognize that much of life resembles a game of chance. Health, wealth, reputation, all can be granted or taken away regardless of our wishes. If we stake our happiness on these externals, We become like gamblers whose joy and despair swing wildly with each roll of the dice. But virtue, wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance remains within our control. By focusing on developing these qualities rather than acquiring externals, the Stoics believed we could achieve a happiness that fortune cannot touch. This isn't resignation, but reorientation, turning our attention to what truly matters and what truly lasts. Seneca expressed this beautifully. The happy life is one that is in accordance with its own nature, and it can be attained in only one way. First, through mental soundness and health, and secondly, through a mind that is courageous and energetic, noble, patient, and adaptable to circumstances. This focus on virtue doesn't mean Stoics rejected external goods entirely. They recognized natural preferences for health over illness, wealth over poverty, friendship over isolation. These preferred indifferents were considered naturally desirable, but not essential for happiness. As Cicero explained in his account of Stoicism, they say that all these things which we call good are indeed according to nature and worthy of selection, but not constituents of the final end. This perspective offers profound liberation. When Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way," he wasn't merely offering consolation for difficulties. He was pointing to the transformative potential in every circumstance, the opportunity to exercise virtue regardless of external conditions. Consider how this applies to our everyday lives. Stuck in traffic? An opportunity to practice patience, facing criticism, a chance to respond with equanimity and learn from feedback. Lost a job? The moment to demonstrate resilience and reinvention. The Stoic doesn't deny these situations are challenging, but sees in each the seeds of virtue and growth. This approach cultivates what the Stoics called apatheia, not emotionlessness, but a state of inner tranquility that comes from aligning our desires with what is actually within our power. From this tranquility springs joy, not the fleeting pleasure that depends on favorable circumstances, but a deeper contentment born of living according to our highest nature. Epictetus, who had been a slave and suffered physical disability, could still proclaim, "I must die. But must I die groaning? I must be imprisoned. But must I whine as well? I must suffer exile. Can anyone then hinder me from going with a smile and a good courage and at peace?" This isn't toxic positivity or denial of suffering. It's the recognition that our response to circumstances remains our own, and in that response lies our freedom and our capacity for happiness. The Stoics didn't promise a life without pain, but they offered something perhaps more valuable, a way to find meaning and even joy within life's inevitable challenges. As we move forward in our exploration, we'll examine how these ancient teachings can be applied in our modern context. We'll look at practical Stoic exercises for cultivating resilience and happiness, and address the criticisms that continue to follow this philosophy. The Stoic path to happiness isn't about lowering our expectations or numbing ourselves to life's difficulties. It's about discovering a more enduring joy through living wisely, justly, and with inner freedom.